Greetings to all my tech heads out there in the KevTechify Nation, and if you're new here, welcome. In this episode, we're going to look at standard organizations. We'll be discussing open standards, internet standards, and electronic and communication standards. This episode is part of my series on Introduction to Networks. I'm Kevin, here at KevTechify. Let's get this adventure started. One of the big things here is we have open standards. Open standards are good. The open standards promote interoperability, meaning different devices can work with each other. They promote competition. Well, if we didn't have competitions, things wouldn't get better, things wouldn't get cheaper. And then we have innovation, because if there's no reason to get better, then we're not going to. So we have these different reasons. Standard organizations, they're supposed to be vendor neutral. It doesn't matter if they're Cisco or another manufacturer of networking. The organizations themselves, they're supposed to be vendor neutral. They're supposed to be a nonprofit organization. That way they're not worried about making a profit for these. So a lot of these organizations are nonprofit. They're set up that way. Their rules are governing them. And they're established to develop and promote the concept of open standards. Once again, we want these open standards where they're vendor neutral and we can see what's going on in it. It's not proprietary. You don't have to pay to use that standard. When we look at internet standards, there's 4 organizations that play a big part in it. The first one, the top one, is the Internet Society. They're there to promote the open development and evolution of the internet. They are the overseers. They're the big pictures. They want to make sure that it stays open for everybody to use. Then right underneath them, if we look at the diagram, we have the Internet Architecture Board. They're responsible for management and development of the internet standards. So they don't necessarily make all of them, but they say, hey, this is a good idea. I think you should do this. And then when they've done it, they're saying, hey, that was a good idea. Yes, let's implement that. So they're there for the management and development of those standards. Then underneath the IAB, we have 2 different organizations. One is the Internet Engineering Task Force, and the other one is the Internet Research Task Force. The Engineering Task Force develops and updates and maintains the Internet and TCP protocols. And so if there's a vulnerability discovered or something like that, they would be the ones responsible for finding and putting that solution out there. The Research Task Force, the Internet Research Task Force, they're focused on long-term research related to the Internet and TCP. Engineering Task Force, fixed on keeping it running and fixing problems. Research Task Force is what is going to be the next evolution of that. So those are our organizations there. Okay, as we talk about internet standards, we have to talk about IP addresses and domain names, how they get handed out. Now, ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, they are responsible for coordinating the effort of all domain names, of all IP addresses, making sure that because each IP address can only be used one place in the world, each domain name can only be used one place in the world. They're responsible for the coordination of it. IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, they're responsible for overseeing and actually managing and handing out those IP addresses. So ICANN coordinates that, because sometimes there's different organizations there, but IANA is one of them, and they actually hand out these IP addresses and domain names. As we talk about electronic and communication standards, there's 4 more organizations that we should mention. First one is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, also known as IEEE. What they're here for is they're responsible for creating standards in power and energy, healthcare, telecommunications, and networks. They make these standards for networking. The second organization is Electronic Industries Alliance, or EIA for short. They develop standards relating to the electrical wiring, connectors, and the different racks and that type of stuff. So they're developing the physical standards for a lot of this. Rack sizes. Rack sizes are 19 inches. They're responsible for doing that. They're for connectors. If you look at the end of an Ethernet cable, that's an RJ45 on it. How wide is it? How tall is it? How deep is it? What are the curves and what do they all do? They're responsible for developing that. Third organization there is the Telecommunications Industry Association. They develop the communication standards for radio, cell towers, voice over IP, satellite communications, and whatever other ones are out there. They develop how those communications work. How do we send that signal? How does it go through the air? How do we encode that information? That's what the TIA organization does. The last one, the fourth one, here's the International Telecommunications Union Telecommunications Standardized Sector. They're responsible for defining standards for like video compression. How do we do that? MPEG-4 down, and then we have the H.264, all these different protocols. They're responsible for doing that. Maybe somebody comes up with it, presents it to them, but then they're the ones responsible for that. The IP television protocol, the live video streaming that's coming in there, broadband communication such as DSL lines. How do we take a normal phone line and turn that into a DSL? They came up with those standards. So these are 4 organizations that do help us as we go through it. IEEE, the EIA, the TIA organization, and the ITUT. It was my pleasure to provide you with this wonderful episode on standard organizations. If you like this episode and you got value out of it, and of course, depending upon what platform you're using, please click that like button, give a 5-star rating, leave a comment. This all helps me bring you more great content. Please take a minute to subscribe to my channel. All of my socials and contact information are on my website, KevTechify.com, and you can get all of these episodes in video and podcast form. In the upper right is my playlist for my series on Introduction to Network. In the bottom right is one of my favorite videos that I linked just for you. Thank you so much for watching this episode on my series on Introduction to Networks. Once again, I'm Kevin. This is KevTechify. I'll see you next time for another great adventure.